of the enormous admiration I have for what Ukraine, its military, and its people have done over the course of this particular year in the face of this brutal, really barbaric and unprovoked invasion of your country. Ukraine, in the future, inevitably, if all of this continues, is going to retake much, if not all, of the territory that Russia has seized since 24 February and perhaps farther. You know, he's already lost hundreds of thousands of the best and brightest in Russia. And now he's losing similar numbers of those who just do not want to fight, who do not want to serve again or at all in the Russian Federation military. So he's in a very, very difficult position. He's grasping for any kind of response because he also has to placate the hardliners in Russia. But I don't see a way out of this situation for him other than eventually recognizing that he's going to have to end what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
So first of all, it's great to meet you. It's nice to meet you. I'm very happy that you find time for us today. And I hope that our conversation will be important, not only for me, yes, like a Ukrainian journalist, but also for all Ukrainian people, because we can answer for a lot of questions that are really important right now. So nice to meet you.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
I want to start from the mobilization that Kremlin announced not long ago. And as media says, we are talking about maybe 1 million mobilized. So it's a great amount of people. So how do you think the events of Russian Ukrainian Front will develop? And if there will be maybe some effective response from the West after that all?
Well, Anastasia, first of all, great to be with you. Especially because of the enormous admiration I have for what Ukraine, its military, and its people have done over the course of this particular year in the face of this brutal, really barbaric and unprovoked invasion of your country. First, let me offer what I think is a very stark reality of the battlefield, of the situation in Ukraine now, that I'm not sure everyone has recognized. And that is that the fact that Ukrainian forces are succeeding in the counteroffensive, particularly Kharkiv in the east now, Luhansk, and then also beginning, of course, in Kherson, that reflects a very significant development in the war. And it is one that is disastrous for Russia. And this reality, this dynamic, is that Ukraine has done massively, incomparably better than Russia in mobilizing additional forces and capabilities, in recruiting, training, equipping, organizing, and now employing additional Ukrainian forces and additional military capabilities. Of course, the support by the United States and other NATO and Western countries has been extraordinarily important in this. The U.S., of course, now over $15 billion just in arms, ammunition, and other military materiel, not counting all the financial and economic assistance, nor the sanctions on Russia and so forth. But what this means is that Ukraine, in the future, inevitably, if all of this continues, is going to retake much, if not all, of the territory that Russia has seized since 24 February and perhaps farther. Russia's mobilization is actually the third or fourth such mobilization since the beginning, of course, if you go back to the mobilization that took place for the training on Ukraine's borders in Russia and Belarus, and then the subsequent efforts that included what I thought was a truly foolish way of trying to generate forces, which was to task every republic in the Russian Federation to provide a battalion. I mean, this is what we did in the Revolutionary War, where every town provides its own militia. That's not a way to produce well-trained, well-equipped, capable, modern military forces. And frankly, this latest partial mobilization is not going to produce decisive results either. At the very least, it won't even get new bodies onto the battlefield for months at best. And it's very questionable whether these former conscripts who had at most a year's worth of service some years or even decades ago, what they will actually provide to Russian forces. Can they even be equipped? They certainly can't be coherent, organized, capable forces. And where do the leaders come from? All of these challenges, I think, are enormous, not to mention the fact that this has turned the Russian population in many of the areas of the Russian Federation against their state, especially as the people see the violations of the terms that were announced and the exemptions and so forth. And they're basically seeing what is, what used to be termed the press gang, where old navies back in a couple of centuries ago used to just go through the slums of cities and just round up young men and put them on ships. That's a little what is going on here. And again, I just do not believe that this is going to be in the least bit decisive. And it really is a sign of how desperate Vladimir Putin has become. This is an act of desperation. This is not a rational, logical, thoughtful, pragmatic approach that's going to produce new capabilities for Russia. And might I also add the threats that he has issued, the veiled threats about the possible use of nuclear weapons and so forth. We should be very worried about that. There's no question about it. The West, the U.S. in particular, has thought through what it will do. Reportedly, according to public statements by the U.S. National Security Advisor, the U.S. has conveyed to Russia what the results, what the consequences of such use would be. And I have to think that the cost-benefit analysis for Vladimir Putin would be to recognize that even a tactical nuclear weapon use, which would do enormous damage on a battlefield, it won't change this dynamic, this reality that I highlighted earlier, which is that Ukraine, even though it's only a third the size of Russia, now has a much bigger and much more capable force on the battlefield. So, okay, a nuclear weapon is used, that would generate enormous, again, consequences for Vladimir Putin and for the Russian forces in Ukraine, I would think, and on the Black Sea. And I think when he does that cost-benefit analysis, he will shrink from that decision.
Well, Putin said that only experiment men will be able to be mobilized, but we all see who's Russia throw to the war in Ukraine. Is it an attempt to get success through quantity, or maybe Putin wants just to buy the time for himself, but this mobilization and this amount, a lot of people?
Well, Putin is confronting a number of serious challenges. There is a rabid right wing in Russia that is criticizing him for not doing enough. And they're quite voluble. They are quite visible. They're very active. Russian authorities have allowed them to continue their activities on social media, in the press, and so forth, because they seemingly support the effort in Ukraine. The problem is that they want more aggressive action than he can take, given the political realities of Russia. Then, on the other hand, you have the individuals who might be subject to this draft, young men, and even in many cases, it appears now, not so young men, and some that haven't even served in the past, all being vacuumed up by these press gangs, if you will, to serve. And again, they don't want to serve, and they're leaving. As you well know, every flight, every way to get out of Russia has been booked solid. And now Russia's going to have to consider limits on travel, even within the republics, perhaps much less outside the country, by military-age males. And this is also generating these substantial demonstrations around the country, particularly in certain republics. Dagestan stands out, of course, but there are many others. And I've seen a map of the numbers and locations of demonstrations in the past 48 hours, and it sprinkles the entire map of the Russian Federation, the populated areas. So he's got that concern now as well, and that is not a trivial concern. Then the question is, even if they get these individuals into uniform, are they really going to fight? And what's their morale going to be like? I mean, morale really does matter. That old saying that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, I can attest to that. I have commanded forces in an invasion of a country, in fact, and as a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 3 times as a 4-star in combat command. So 5 combat commands in the course of 6 commands as a general officer alone. This morale issue is not trivial. And of course, the morale of Ukrainian forces is very, very high because of the successes recently, because of a recognition that they can take back, they can liberate Ukrainian territory and people. And also, of course, the obvious fact that Ukrainians are fighting for their country's survival and territorial integrity. This is in some respects your revolutionary war. This is your effort to establish, again, your very existence in the face of a much larger country that does not believe Ukraine has a right to exist. So this is an extraordinary moment for Ukrainian soldiers, and they have responded brilliantly, as have, of course, Ukrainian leaders all the way up to the very top, including, of course, President Zelensky, the chief of your general staff, and so forth. So the contrast between the, again, morale and capabilities, situation, and so forth of Ukrainian forces, who, of course, are supported by the people in whose areas they're located and welcomed when they liberate, and contrast that with the Russians, who are hated by most of the people in the areas that they occupy, are subject to increasing insurgent and guerrilla and terrorist activity in those areas, and don't want to be there, not fighting for their country's survival, et cetera, et cetera. This dynamic is very, very stark. Putin, I'm sure, looks in the mirror and says, I'm a leader of a strong people. We know how to suffer. We outsuffered Napoleon. We outsuffered the Nazis. We can outsuffer the Ukrainians and their Western supporters. He's wrong. And again, this situation right now, I think, is absolutely disastrous for him. He's trying anything he can, and this is really all he can do. Keep in mind as well, of course, that the military industrial base of Russia has been crippled as well by a variety of factors, not the least of which is the export controls on providing microchips to Russia, which the U.S. is enforcing, but also just by the element that has challenged everything in Russia, including, it turns out, in the military, which is just sheer corruption, ineptitude, and inadequate leadership, to put it mildly.
Well, the Russians are trying to hold illegal referendums right now in our territories as far as they can know, and we all know the results of these referendums as long before they started. So why do you think that is so important for Putin to make these referendums, and what benefits can he have after that? Maybe he can increase the number of troops here, or maybe additional mobilization can turn to the general one. So what do you think? What can it be after these referendums, or even after the inaction of a part of Ukraine?
Well, clearly he wants to, again, have a justification for annexing parts of Ukraine that are now occupied by Russian forces, so that they can indeed round up the young men and say, you're now Russian citizens, you must fight for the Russian Federation. So that's one element of this without question. And of course, one reason I think they're racing to complete this by 1 October is because that's when the fall conscription effort begins throughout the Russian Federation in any given year. Beyond that, of course, then he can say, well, this is now Russian territory, and we will defend this by all means necessary because, of course, again, it's our soil. Now, I think that rings hollow. As I mentioned earlier, the cost-benefit analysis that I think he will do will result in him shrinking from a decision to use any kind of weapon of mass destruction, because again, it's not going to change the reality on the battlefield, and it will change the reality globally and turn everyone against him. I'm quite confident. Even those that abstained from voting in the past in the United Nations, in that General Assembly condemnation of Russia, and then in the vote on to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council in the UN, even those countries, I think, can no longer stand on the sidelines if Russia uses nuclear weapons. And we saw, of course, in the recent meetings between President Putin and President Xi, and also President Putin and Prime Minister Modi, that the Chinese and Indian leaders actually expressed concerns. That is a big deal. So this partnership without limit between Russia and China that was announced on the eve of the Olympic ceremony, opening ceremony, and before the invasion, turns out to have significant limits after all.
Well, as to the counteroffensive of Ukraine, we see that our armed forces are doing a great job. We incredibly success in the Kharkiv region. Armed forces of Ukraine returned back for 50 kilometers in the 3 days. So it's really awesome job. So how do you think the armed forces of Ukraine succeeds and have enabled to achieve such a result in such a short piece of time?
Well, the Ukrainian forces have succeeded because they are better trained, better equipped, better motivated, better led, better organized, and better employed than Russian forces, which is really quite remarkable, because I remember talking to Ukrainian commanders in the past, and they said, we've never even trained on offensive operations, much less actually conducted them for real. The training has always been almost exclusively on defensive operations. So this is really quite extraordinary. And the bottom line is that you see here not just the sheer determination and courage, and again, morale on the Ukrainian side, because their cause is so just and so right and so important to the very survival of the country. It's beyond that. There's a resourcefulness here that is just incredibly impressive. The way that, again, the tractor army has pulled the Russian tanks and armored vehicles, and then they've been repaired. The way your industry continues to maintain the various military equipment that you have in the face of very substantial fighting. The very creative ways in which commanders have employed forces and actually done something that the Russians have not done before, which is to achieve combined arms effects. In other words, not just to run tanks at the enemy, but to have the tanks supported by infantry, by mortars, by artillery, by air defense, by electronic warfare, by engineers, by explosive ordnance disposal, by every particular capability that can be brought to bear, and then effectively supported logistically with additional arms, medical evacuation. All of this is really complex stuff. And again, I've done this at the 2, 3, and 4-star level. This is incredibly complex, especially for a force that doesn't have a huge expeditionary logistics capability. You're largely operating from essentially fixed bases, and you're building all of this as you fight. Your army was nowhere near the size that it is now. So in the middle of very, very high intensity conflict and combat, Ukraine has built this extraordinary additional capability, new capability, and now is employing it very, very impressively. Yes, there is lots of assistance when it comes to the equipment being provided, especially, I'm proud to say, by the United States. Yes, there's enormous help with maintenance, but of course it's outside the border by and large. yes, there's staggering quantities of ammunition. I think we're up to 750,000 rounds of heavy artillery just from the United States. And just to give the listener some idea of what that means, you can only put about 40 to 45 rounds in a standard 5-ton truck. So think of just the sheer number of tens of thousands of trucks required to get that from the Polish border across a country that is the size of the state of Texas, our largest state in the lower 48. So all of this, yes, and yes, there is even help without question with intelligence sharing and also with campaign planning, design, wargaming, and so forth that the U.S. and other NATO countries are providing. But at the end of the day, you can have all the help you need. It comes down to, are the soldiers and their leaders going to fight effectively, courageously, and with determination? And Ukrainian forces have clearly answered that question with a resounding yes, yes, yes.
How do you think will be the armed forces of Ukraine will be able to repeat this Kharkiv Oblast scenario in other territories?
Yes, although again, the context will be different in each location. Obviously, it's easier to replicate what was done in Kharkiv in the more rural areas. If you're in a more urban area, such as that in Kherson, it's much more challenging. No matter how good you are, an enemy in urban areas can defend it, and it takes enormous skill and frankly a very substantial number of just boots on the ground to clear and then hold areas in suburban and urban settings. Look, the Ukrainians demonstrated this brilliantly, of course, in the defense of Kyiv. Also, frankly, Sumy, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv, among others. So those will be slower. That it'll be, you'll have to eat at it a bit, if you will, and very patiently isolate the battlefield, as Ukrainian forces have done very effectively by taking down the bridges and then even the pontoon bridges created by Russia on the Dnipro River to prevent the Russians from being able to provide logistics and so forth. And also the very effective use of the precision rockets and artillery that the United States has provided. Keeping in mind that the precision rockets, the Gimler, it's called, the guided missile launch rocket system, which is a range of over 70 kilometers and can land on a dinner table. By the way, they cost well over $100,000 a piece. Ukraine has used those to enormous effect, taking out very precisely the Russian headquarters in Kherson, and then those even supporting Kherson just across the Dnipro. Also, of course, the ammo storage points, the fuel depots, the troop assembly areas, barracks for Russian and other forces and so forth. And that's been done superbly. Again, I have a considerable amount of experience with those kinds of munitions. Even in urban settings, such as in Baghdad, when I was the commander of the surge in Iraq. And it takes enormous skill to do this properly. And Ukrainians have demonstrated that skill in a number of cases in the past month or two now.
The chief of Ukrainian intelligence, Kirill Budanov, said that he believes that by the end of this year, armed forces of Ukraine can have a chance to enter the territory of our Crimea. So how do you think the chances are, and what do you think about this development of situation, if we really can enter the territory of Crimea till the end of this year?
Well, I think this is a question that can only be answered accurately and honestly by saying it depends. And clearly it depends on whether there is a collapse of Russian morale in certain areas. Do Russian forces literally just erode, crumble, run, and so forth? We've seen some of that in isolated situations so far, but not widespread. If that takes place, then there's no question that this is a possibility. And again, how does Ukraine continue to do with the continued force generation process? Because I mentioned, what's happening on the battlefield is a reflection of what has happened in this force generation competition, where Ukraine is doing vastly better, incomparably better than is Russia doing, and than Russia can do. There's just no way, even with this partial mobilization, that Russia can reverse a dynamic that is solidly against them. Also, of course, it depends on, how harsh is the winter weather. I think personally that Ukrainian forces will continue to fight, especially in the south throughout the winter. I don't think it's going to slow them all that much. I think it will actually be tougher on the Russians. But again, we have to see how that evolves as well. And can there be individual breakthroughs, just as were achieved in this early campaign in Kharkiv Oblast, that result, and again, an opportunity that Ukrainian forces can seize and then exploit? And can they then bring the logistics up and so forth? Because, of course, what happened is you got the Russian forces on the run, but at a certain point in time, forces actually have to slow a bit. It's the same as when we were doing the fight to Baghdad. We went actually hundreds of miles into it. And then it wasn't just the dust storm. It was we were literally about to run out of fuel, had to get resupplied, had to get, again, water, food, everything else. Some of that a little bit easier in Ukraine because you're on your own soil with local individuals that will support, but that can't sustain a force. That can't provide ammunition, again, the kind of bulk fuel and all the rest of that is required. So I think it is possible. I think Ukrainian forces have shown that anything is possible. But then let me also point out that there is one capacity that Russia does continue to have, sadly and tragically, and that is the capacity to punish Ukraine, to continue to hit civilian infrastructure, such as power generation, such as power transmission, hospitals. Again, these are normally off limits for military forces. Certainly the hospital would be civilian infrastructure and so forth. But what Russia has been doing, because this is all they can do now, is to just hit, again, civilian infrastructure that is within range of their rockets, their missiles, and some of those missiles obviously can reach throughout the entire country. And so I do think there will come times where the leadership in Kyiv is going to have to ask, okay, should we start thinking about how we try to bring this to some kind of conclusion? President Zelensky himself has said that there has to be a negotiated resolution at some point. Where is that point? How much does Ukraine retake, obviously including Crimea? And by the way, can there be, as I believe there should be, a very durable security guarantee to Ukraine from the US and NATO countries? That element, I think, has to be part of an ultimate negotiated resolution. I think that this time we just say to Moscow, look, we were sensitive to your concerns in the past about Ukraine joining NATO. And how did that turn out? Without provocation, you invaded. This time that can no longer be a case. That guarantee is going to be crucial to the future of Ukraine, because without it, outside investment and whatever kind of Marshall Plan can be developed just cannot succeed. The critical ingredient in the success of the Marshall Plan, which of course was a modest, reasonable amount of US money into European countries that have been devastated by World War II, the really crucial ingredient provided by the US was a security guarantee. And that's what really enabled this money to be very effective in repriming the pump that existed, if you will, the human capital that was there, even with the industrial destruction that followed World War II. So for the reconstruction of Ukraine, for the revitalization of its economy, the restoration of its basic services that have been damaged and so forth, noting how admirable Ukrainian engineers and others have been in doing this during the war, but to really bring Ukraine back to where it was and then beyond that, a security guarantee, I think, is going to be absolutely essential. It's critical. It has to be. There's no substitute for that. And I think that, again, as there are thoughts about how do we bring this to some kind of negotiated resolution, that there may be some trade-offs to be considered, especially if it gets this security guarantee that is, again, can make the negotiated resolution durable.
There is an opinion that as soon as armed forces will enter the Crimea, Russia may use a nuclear strike. And in particular, in the last address, Putin said that he again threatened that Russia can use this nuclear weapon. And now all world is talking about that. So do you think that such a scenario is possible right now, or maybe when armed forces of Ukraine will have counteroffensive at the territory of Crimea?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that that possibility has to be taken very seriously. And one element of taking it seriously is to communicate to Putin and Russian leaders what the likely consequences would be, not entirely specific, but sufficiently specific and clear that Russia does not take that action. And my understanding, based on, again, on public statements by the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, someone for whom I have enormous admiration, seriously bright individual with long time service with President Biden. My understanding from his public statements is that this communication has been effected with Russia. And that's what I believe, again, would lead to this cost-benefit analysis that makes it unlikely that Putin would use nuclear weapons, but cannot rule that out. So again, this is something that has to be taken very seriously, has to be thought through, has to result in actions on our part that communicate clearly to Moscow, to the Kremlin, what the consequences would be, and make it as unlikely as is absolutely possible.
Well, weapons is extremely important in successful counteroffensive now. And in your opinion, what are the prospects of helping Ukraine with weapons from the West now? And what can Ukraine expect in the nearest future?
Well, what has been provided is staggering in its quantity. Again, $15.1 billion just from the United States, billions more from many other countries, and almost all of the Eastern European countries that had the kind of equipment that Ukraine could use immediately and had experience with and had the right caliber. So, if you will, the old Warsaw Pact or Soviet bloc or Russian equipment that Ukraine largely has in its tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, all of that has been provided to Russia, even including helicopters from the United States that were going to have gone to Afghanistan, also aircraft from some of the Eastern European countries. Again, not always publicly announced for various reasons, but that has gone on. And again, then this staggering quantity of U.S. anti-tank guided missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, huge quantity of heavy artillery, 126 howitzers, plus vehicles to pull them, plus again, over 750,000 rounds for that, with a small number of those, again, being these rounds that are so precise that they can, again, land on a dinner table, and that cost over $100,000. The multiple launch rocket systems that we have provided, as have, again, other countries, and again, very substantial numbers of rounds for those as well. And those reach out to over 70 kilometers, again, some of those being very, very precise. There will be some reluctance, I think, to provide certain types of items, such as, say, M1 Abrams tanks from the United States, just because they're so unbelievably heavy, much, much heavier than the tanks that are operating currently. And I don't know that the bridges will actually sustain them in many of the locations. And beyond that, the operation of them, really the maintenance of them, requires so much in terms of diagnostics, tests, kits, specially trained mechanics, and everything is so, again, heavy that you can't even repair it or get it back to the border without a special carrier and without a special actually recovery vehicle that is based on an M1 chassis, because it has to be that heavy. Keep in mind, this is a 1,500 horsepower jet turbine, basically, that powers this. It's not a diesel engine or something like that. And again, I think there's just a wariness that we're going to give them, that we would give these to Ukraine and they would quickly become inoperable. The truth is that even the towed howitzers initially, there were issues with the hydraulics because we didn't give enough trucks to them. We had to pull those out, bring them back. So there's a real sensitivity, I think, to providing weapon systems that just would be very, very difficult to maintain. Again, I had, hundreds of tanks under my command at various times, and again, the intensity of the maintenance was extraordinary. And then I guess there are understandable concerns about providing weapons with such enormous range that it could, in some scenario, go into Russia, and that could precipitate, again, a wider conflict. And I think if you put yourself in the shoes of those who are, at the head of the Situation Room table in the West Wing of the White House, that you have to, I think, understand, I guess, or be sensitive to the kinds of concerns that I think are unavoidable there, no matter how much my inclination might be to give Ukraine anything they want. And so what I think is an area of enormous focus right now, and has been being provided, is additional capacity in the air defense realm. And this NASAMS, the system that has been provided, that President Zelensky acknowledged recently, these are very, very important. We have to continue, we need to increase that supply, because the real vulnerability of Ukraine now is less about Russian ground forces and more about, again, missiles, rockets being used to punish Ukraine, and also now the advent of these suicide drones and other drones that Russia has purchased from Iran. So we've really got to increase the amount provided there. But look, I can assure you, I know for a fact, because I've talked to individuals involved in this, there is very active dialogue between Ukraine's military leaders and military leaders in the West. There is an organization in Europe that is focused solely on this particular effort and facilitating it, ensuring the flow and the maintenance and so forth. We know where every one of those 126 howitzers and the other major end items, as they're termed, are located, and can help repair them if they are inoperable because of maintenance reasons or battle damage or what have you. So there should be no question that the United States has bipartisan support on Capitol Hill and in the White House to continue to provide staggering quantities. I mean, it's almost been, between $500 million and $1 billion additional dollars worth of supply every single week since the beginning of the war. We've literally given all that we have of certain types of munitions, our own, for example, loitering munitions, suicide drones, some of these other capabilities. And we're have been activating our industrial base to produce more of those kinds of systems, and many, many more. But again, it's almost hard to understand how staggering $15.1 billion of arms, ammunition, and equipment actually is. I'm sure it is many multiples of the annual defense budget of Ukraine prior to the war.
What do you think? Should the United States increase supplies of technological weapons to Ukraine to counter Russian aggression?
Well, again, I believe this dialogue between Ukrainian leaders and American leaders has resulted in provision of literally just about everything we can possibly provide that can be employed effectively by Ukraine without, to be fair, concerns over escalation that could result from some of those. So, there's no reservations on the part of the U.S. In providing something if it can be, again, maintained, effectively employed, and so forth. And that will continue. That has been the case, and I'm very confident it will continue to be the case. Again, the key is that in Washington, there is enormous support from both of our political parties. The minority leader in the Senate is the biggest champion of Ukraine in the Senate, together certainly with the majority leader. But I mean, he personally he's in the minority, and yet he is championing the policy and actually pushing the administration often constantly to do more, and they are doing more without question.
Well, and some words about NATO. The NATO was created as one of the most powerful blocs. And first of all, it was created to counter the threat from the previous USSR and then from the Russia. So do you think it's rather paradoxical situation when Ukraine, even with enormous help from the West, which we talked previously, is doing all alone on the battlefield right now, while the most powerful bloc on the planet is just standing aside? It was created for this purpose.
Well, by no means are NATO countries standing aside. I would respectfully challenge that very strongly. They are very, very heavily involved and heavily engaged. And in fact, as a result of that, they're going to have what could be a challenging winter. So it's not just the provision of massive quantities of arms and ammunition. In some cases, all the tanks that a country has have been provided to Ukraine. Yes, there's a promise to replace them again with M1 Abrams tanks from the US or Leopard from Germany or something like that. But again, the support for Ukraine has been really actually unbelievable if you think about what was the prospect was prior to the invasion. It has been truly, truly extraordinary. U.S. has led it, to be sure, but really every country in NATO has been part of this, and those in certain parts of the region, particularly so. But it's beyond that. It's the sanctions, the financial, the economic, the personal sanctions that the countries have come together to impose on Russia, U.S., EU, UK, other Western countries. Which again they're not crippling, because at the end of the day, Russia has gas, oil, coal, agricultural products, and minerals that the world has to have. It cannot do without them. But it's throwing Russia into a serious recession. Its GDP will be down by 8 to 10% this year at least. Over 1,000 U.S. and Western companies have either shut down completely or reduced what they're doing there. There are export controls, as I mentioned earlier, on microchips to Russia, which are crippling its defense industry, et cetera, et cetera. And Western countries, European countries, are paying a price for this. I was just in Berlin a week ago, and they're very concerned about how they're going to get through the winter. Yes, their natural gas storage level is good. It's solid. It's over 85% or so. But if you look at what they can expect to get and what they might have to use if it's a very cold winter, they're going to have to really restrict that use. So again, they're not standing back. And in fact, the irony of all of this is that Putin set out to make Russia great again. And what he has really done is make NATO great again. The cohesion of NATO has never been this great since the end of the Cold War, the unity of effort and purpose. And of course, his unprovoked invasion has prompted two countries that were traditionally neutral and are very geostrategically located, Finland and Sweden, to join NATO. And at the end of this, I think there will inevitably be some durable security relationship between NATO and Ukraine as well. Just one other paradox or irony, if you will, and that is that Vladimir Putin loathed Gorbachev because, of course, he holds Gorbachev responsible for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the event in the 20th century that Putin said was the worst in the entire century. This a century, of course, that had World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression. But in his view, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe was the dissolution of the USSR. And he didn't even go to Gorbachev's funeral, which would seem to be somewhat impolite, if you will, or not in accordance with protocol, that you go to the ceremonies that honor those who came before you. And now he is doing to Russia what Gorbachev did to the Soviet Union, irreparable damage. It will take, even after this is resolved, it's going to take decades for Russia to get back to where it was. and the damage, the sheer loss. Russia has lost many times the soldiers that it lost in nearly a decade of war in Afghanistan, just in the first 7 months of this war. And then you multiply times 3, typically, the number of wounded, seriously wounded, who can't return to combat. This is catastrophic for Russia, and it is all a result of a decision made by President Putin, and his country is now paying for it.
Well, actually, the situation with UN clearly showed that the organization can no longer guarantee security in the world, especially when the aggressor of the country is a permanent member and have the right for the veto. So don't you think the UN needs a fundamental reform, and the institution of the permanent member of the Security Council says, like Orwell always says, that there are all animals are equal, but some are equal more?
This is another one of those great paradoxes, because, of course, to reform the UN would require a vote by the Security Council. And, of course, you have at least one member who would resist that. I'm quite confident of probably others as well. So, look, the UN has never truly lived up to the hopes that various countries had for it. There have been repeated challenges over the years, particularly when it comes to security issues. The Cold War, the Security Council was a bit of a political or geopolitical battlefield as well. And that is the reality. So all that can be done, again, as always, is the best that can be done, and make use of it to the greatest extent possible. But recognize that there are limitations. Don't have aspirations that are unrealistic. Just try again to make the best use possible of what does exist. And if there are opportunities for reform down the road, certainly seize them. But my expectation is that you're not going to see some supranational organization that is going to guarantee security in the form of the United Nations, at least.
Well, we know that U.S. actively shares intelligence with Ukraine. And in your opinion, how effectively our Ukrainian military use this information from the USA?
Well, I don't want to get into details here, but I think it is fair to say that Ukraine appears to be making very effective use of whatever information intelligence is being shared with it from Western countries.
Okay, and well, back in March, you mentioned 4 possible war scenarios, and among them was the one from with Ukraine wins on the battlefield, and this reality is guaranteed accepted by Russia. And another scenario is a bloody from Russia. It can be worse than the Soviet war with Afghanistan, and both actually came true. So how likely is the actual recognition of military defeat by Russia? What do you think?
Well, first, if I could, I might also note that I don't want to be I told you so, but I did. Before the invasion, in The Atlantic, one of our great journals, I did an interview, and I said, Russia will never take Kyiv, much less control it. And that was at a time when an awful lot of people thought that Russia was going to roll right through the capital, topple the government, replace President Zelensky, and go home to a victory parade. And I just didn't believe that that would happen. I've been on the ground in Ukraine a number of times. The most recent was just pre-COVID, after President Zelensky's election. I visited Ukrainian forces in the Donbass, in Kharkiv, the leaders in Kyiv, and I came away very impressed by what I saw. And obviously the development continued well, very impressively beyond that. And so I did not think it was impossible that actually Ukraine could actually win. And now there were many skeptics over the months. There were people that challenged these assessments in July and even in August. And I said, let's just wait till mid-September. And if you go to my LinkedIn feed, you'll see that in mid-September, I actually raised this issue again with the individuals that were calling these predictions into question. and said, well, so, how do you see this now? So look, I do think, as I mentioned at the outset, and perhaps this can be where we wrap this up, there is a new reality on the battlefield in Ukraine. Not everyone yet recognizes it, but that reality is a very, very stark one for Russia, that Ukraine has done vastly better at force generation than Russia has. So the implications of that are that Ukraine will continue to take back territory from Russia that was seized since 24 February and could certainly have the capacity to go farther, whether it wants to or not. Now we're talking about political decisions that will have to be made in Kyiv, leading to potential, again, negotiated resolution of the war. But that reality is, again, irreversible for Russia. Yes, I think the world is rightly concerned about the partial mobilization and all that, but my assessment is they will not be able to take, even if these are former conscripts who are in reasonable physical condition and they only had 1 year's worth of service years ago, and there's no sign that the Russian training base and force generation capacity is remotely comparable to that which Ukraine has established with the help of NATO countries, NATO training centers, NATO wargaming centers, NATO equipment, arms, ammunition, material, and so forth. So Russia is not going to be able to reverse this disastrous situation in which it now finds itself. And at some point, again, it's going to have to realize there's really nothing they can do, even the use, again, of a tactical nuclear weapon, which would be hugely catastrophic for Russia and obviously for the area where it's used, but will not reverse the situation on the battlefield. It will not extricate Russia from this disastrous situation, this disastrous new reality in which they find themselves.
And is there a possible scenario in which Russia military command can stage a military coup or announce a refusal to obey? What do you think?
Well, I think all of those are, in the realm of conceivable, at least. I mean, just the fact that you can mention it means that it's a possibility that could be considered. But there are many realms, I think, of that. And again, the question is, are there individual units or soldiers that collapse, surrender, do what President Zelensky suggested they should do, which is not fight but defect? Or is this widespread? And you really don't know that. Again, I've been in battles where we fought for several days and all of a sudden the enemy just collapses. And I looked back at, was there something we did that brought about that collapse? And not necessarily. It just happens at a certain point. It becomes organic. And one cannot predict that. It's a possibility. It's something I hope to see, frankly, so that Putin realizes that he just cannot fight on. And I think, again, keep in mind, again, the disruption, the demonstrations, the outrage by citizens in Russia, and the terrible effect this is having on his population. He's already lost hundreds of thousands of the best and brightest in Russia. And now he's losing similar numbers of those who just do not want to fight, who do not want to serve again or at all in the Russian Federation military. So he's in a very, very difficult position. He's grasping for any kind of response because he also has to placate the hardliners in Russia. But I don't see a way out of this situation for him other than eventually recognizing that he's going to have to end what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Presumably there will be some kind of negotiated resolution and it will be made durable by a security guarantee from the West. Now, again, these are all personal views. These are not obviously anything official from the United States, but it's something I've thought a great deal about, and it seems to me to be the only likely outcome at some point. But when that point will arrive is difficult to say.
Well, and my last question is, I just want to know your point of view. So what do you think, how and when this bloody war started by Russia against Ukraine can end? And what should partners of Ukraine do right now to make this victory come as much quickly as possible?
Well, what, again, the U.S. and NATO and other Western nations should continue to do is to pile on the military support, the additional arms, ammunition, materiel, other weaponry, other capabilities that Ukraine needs and can employ effectively, and that last piece is important. That has to be done. And again, I am very confident that is being done. Again, Jake Sullivan and others have publicly stated this is the intent of the United States. I have heard this. I heard it when I was in Berlin most recently from not just Germans, but from other leaders. I'll be at the Warsaw Security Forum in another week from now. And I'm sure that we will hear that echoed. And by the way, that's worth watching very carefully because many of the defense ministers of NATO nations will be there for that gathering next week. As to the predictions, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very, very hard to say when precisely this war may end. I think it's easier to say how I think it may end, which is, again, there has to be a negotiated resolution after Ukraine has retaken vastly more of its territory than it has so far, perhaps all the way up to the 24 February line, perhaps even farther. But that will be a political or a geopolitical issue for President Zelensky and Ukrainian leaders and citizens, really, to reach conclusion about as they go forward. Noting that obviously there will have to be interaction at some point with the Kremlin, and that perhaps some Western countries can facilitate that in certain ways. But again, I think the U.S. approach, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, has been absolutely right. But it depends, again, on many factors that we have discussed here, particularly having to do, again, with Russian morale, Russian willingness of soldiers and units to continue to fight for a cause that many of them have to question. They're on soil where they're hated by the individuals they are that are around them and territory they are occupying. It's got to be a terrible situation for them. Winter is coming. It's going to be very challenging. And again, if that cracks, if it crumbles, if it collapses, obviously that will accelerate the timeline. If not, there will be further tough fighting and, sadly, further punishment of Russia, by Russia, of Ukraine, particularly civilian infrastructure, which is, again, one of the areas that we've got to rush to augment Ukrainian capability to protect, again, the air defense, anti-ballistic missile defense, early warning, and so forth. What I am confident in, however, is the very strong continued support of Ukraine. And having seen what we have, I'm also absolutely confident the Ukrainian forces are going to continue to impress the rest of the world enormously in the weeks and months that lie ahead. What they are doing and have done is extraordinary. It is historic. It is, again, the fight for Ukrainian independence, your battle for independence. And in that, I'm very confident that Ukraine will prevail.
Well, thank you so much for these words, and thank you so much for our conversation. It was a great honor to talk with you, and I hope that everybody who will watch our conversation will have all answers for all of their questions.